Students, in a last lecture, we talked about female gametophyte development. With that, both male and female gametophyte development, these topics are completed. We switch over to the next topic, that is pollination. The transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma, that is termed as pollination. Pollination refers to process of transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. As you know, at a maturity, anther dehisces, releases the pollen grain, and these pollen grains reach up to the stigma. This process is identified as pollination. There are different kinds of pollination, mainly autogamy, geitonogamy, and xenogamy. Three major forms of pollination include autogamy, geitonogamy, and xenogamy. This is based on pollination occurring in which flowers. Within the flower, autogamy. Between the flowers of the same plant, it's called geitonogamy. And pollination between the flowers of two different plants, that is termed as xenogamy. So based on this aspect, there are three different forms of pollination. First one, we talk about autogamy. Simple terms, pollination in a same flower. As you see that if pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma within the same flower, then it is termed as autogamy. Transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Anther is also in the same flower. Stigma is also in the same flower. The contrivances for self-pollination, the essentialities, the conditions that are must for self-pollination. Without these conditions, contrivances means adaptations for self-pollination. That's how you can consider this aspect. The things which will support the self-pollination, it will support the autogamy. They are the contrivances of self-pollination. The first thing that can help in self-pollination is bisexual flower. See, in a way, it is a compulsion for the autogamy that the flower must be bisexual. Imagine a flower itself is a pistillate flower and another one is a staminate flower. So they cannot have a autogamy within themselves individually within the one flower. It is not possible. So understand that. Most important requirement for the autogamy is bisexuality of flower. The second thing that can promote self-pollination or autogamy, then that is synchrony in pollen release and stigma receptivity. See, when anther dehisces to release the pollen, the mature pollen, and if it is a bisexual flower, it is likely to drop on the stigma of the same flower. And if that stigma at that time, if it is receptive enough, receptive means what? Receptive means it is allowing the germination of pollen grain in that period. So we say it is receptive enough. So both are showing the synchronization in this, the parallelity in the timings, that is release of pollen and stigma receptivity period. If they are same, the chances are getting higher. It is called homogamy. This phenomenon is called homogamy. This enhances the chances of self-fertilization. Stigma and anther lying close to each other. See the height at which the stigma is placed, and parallel is the height at which your anthers are there. So greater chance that when they will burst off, release the pollens are likely to drop easily on the stigma. And one more phenomenon that can help in self-pollination, and that is a spatial phenomenon. These are very commonly seen features in a self-pollinating autogamous plants. But this is the spatial feature which is there in only specialized few plants which prefer the self-pollination. This includes plants such as oxalis, plants such as viola, that is called common pansy. Another plant is called as commalina. So plants such as commalina, oxalis, and viola. Viola called as common pansy also. These are the ones which exhibit a specialized phenomenon that is termed as cleistogamy. Let me explain what is a cleistogamy over here. In these type of plants, which I call as a cleistogamous, those which exhibit cleistogamy, these plants exhibit development of two different types of flowers: chasmogamous flowers and cleistogamous flowers. Two varieties of flowers, chasmogamous and cleistogamous. Chasmogamous flowers are normal flowers which are aerial, which are colorful, which are having anther and stigma, and they are open for both autogamy as well as the other forms of pollination. They can perform all, I mean, self-pollination and cross-pollination for which they are open. Another type of flowers that are seen in these plants, they are seen in an underground stem. Underground stem, it possesses specialized flowers. These underground flowers are known as cleistogamous flowers. Can you imagine flower being born underground, underneath the soil? So these are not aerial, these are supposed to be underground. Second, these are bisexual flowers. They have a stigma and anther, carpels and stamens. These are the ones which do not open at all. They show no anthesis. No anthesis means they never open. Now imagine if flower doesn't open. Normally the flower opens, exposes its stamens and stigma. But here the flower doesn't open. It remains closed. So even at a maturity, when anther dehisces and releases the stamens, they are going to drop on the, releases the pollen by mistake. They're going to drop on the stigma itself over there. And once the flower is closed permanently, no chance of external pollen to come inside. So these plants in which pollination will occur as only one method, autogamy, only one method, that is a self-pollination, no option of cross-pollination. See, these chasmogamous flowers are aerial flowers. They open up, they show anthesis. So they have two options. They can show self-pollination or they can even show cross-pollination. But these are underground in nature, these clastogamous flowers, they do not show anthesis, they never open up. So they have only one option, and that is the self-pollination. So we say clistogamous kind of flowers is a speciality of limited number of plants. To confirm, they will have a self-pollination only. At least in these flowers of their plants, there will be only self-pollination, no other option available. So once the pollination occurs within the closed buds, it has to be the only one, and that is the self-pollination. This can confirm the autogamy. No chance of cross-pollination, 100% ensured arrangement, just one option, autogamy is there. But this setup has its own merits and demerits. You see, the merit is that this setup doesn't require any pollinators. If your dependence on pollinators is removed over here, you have a pollination within the closed flowers. No need to have a pollinator. So that dependence on pollinators, the rewards that are to be arranged for pollinators, those issues are solved. So assured seed set का meaning होता है 100% confirmation that seed will be formed in the absence of pollinators. But the demerit of this setup is it's a self-fertilization, self-pollination. No genetic variation will be there. There will be no chance of genetic variation. It's almost like a clone to be formed by these seeds. Actually, though, seed formation is a sexual reproduction. It should be able to generate variation in plants. But here, because it's only one plant and self-fertilization is there, this avoids genetic variation. And genetic variation loss is a major loss in the plant world, in the living world. Some kind of genetic variations are always required. So demerit and merit, the disadvantages as well as advantages, both are there on the part of clastogamous flowers over there. So that was the profile of the autogamy. The second the second option available for pollination, and that is geitonogamy. Look at this one. Pollination is taking place from the one, it is between two different flowers of the same plant. Pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma of another flower of a same plant. See, functionally, it is a cross-pollination. It's a pollination that is taking place between the two different flowers. It will require pollinators. So it's a kind of a cross-pollination. But genetically, if you see, then it is still an autogamy. How come it is an autogamy? It's the same organism. Its own gametes are used, isn't it? जैसे tapeworm में होता ना, same tapeworm के sperms and eggs का अगर fertilization होता है, so it's a self-fertilization. If you carry out pollination within the same flower, that is autogamy. Or if you carry out pollination between two flowers of a same plant, that is called geitonogamy. Ultimately, genetically, it is the self-fertilization only. Again, this one will have a lesser chances of genetic variation. Third option available, xenogamy. The two different plants, between them the pollination is taking place. The pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma on the flower to be found on another plant. Obviously इसमें दो possibilities हो सकती है ना. Successful fertilization के लिए the other different plant should be of a same species. Otherwise it's a meaningless transfer. So for a successful xenogamy, pollen should be transferred from the anther in the flower of a one plant to the stigma in the flower of another plant that belongs to same species. Functionally and genetically, it is a true cross-pollination. It will require the pollinating agents. So functionally, it is a cross-pollination. Pollination between two different flowers and in a way, two different plants also. And genetically also, it is a cross-pollination because two different individual organisms, two different plants are involved. So there will be a genetic variation in the same. So that is about the xenogamy. A large number of plants prefer xenogamy over there. Well, from my side, I have concluded the first topic. Have you all understood the pollination and its types? Okay, well, fine. Question number 1. What is pollination? Helisha, super fast answer. Transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. First one. What is autogamy? Autogamy refers to what? Yes, Krisha and others. Pollination within this. Somebody wrote wrong answer. Same plant. Let me find who is that one. I'm curious to know that. Because that person is spreading wrong information. Muhammad Waris, it's absolutely wrong answer. When I say autogamy, you have to stick to those lines. Pollination within the same flower, because geitonogamy is also a pollination within the same plant. Waris, you understand that? You understand your mistake? Yeah. So basically, autogamy is a pollination in a same flower. The contrivances का meaning होता है the adaptations which favor the given process. So the contrivances for the self-pollination include number 1, bisexuality of flower. Yes, it will promote the self-pollination. It will promote the autogamy. It's not compulsion that if you are a bisexual flower, you will always have a autogamy. But other way, if you see it's a compulsion, autogamy will require bisexuality of a flower. That is the compulsion. Second aspect, homogamy, which means, yes, Nandini and Astha and all, synchrony in pollen release and stigma receptivity. If these two timings are same in a same season, when anthers really release their pollen, the stigma, they are also ready to receive and let them germinate. So that means it will favor the autogamy or self-pollination. The third factor, yes, the close vicinity between the anther and stigma. The height-wise, they should be parallel to each other. So this enhances the chances of self-pollination, which is the specialized mechanism. The fourth mechanism, Pushti and Krisha and all, correct. Cleistogamy. That is termed as which one? Cleistogamy. Cleistogamy is something which is a specialized mechanism to ensure the self pollination. Give me some information on cleistogamy. First of all, examples of the plants which exhibit cleistogamy. Viola, oxalis, and Commelina. And what is another name for viola? Yes, it's called common pansy. Common pansy. That's another name of it. Achha, these plants are having two different types of flowers in them. These flowers which are above the ground, what you call them as yes, they are to be termed as casmogamous flowers. See, they are aerial, colorful, they are bisexual, and they are showing anthesis, and they are available for both, and that is geitonogamy and autogamy and xenogamy. For everything, they are open. What you call these flowers which grow from the underground rhizome. Rhizome is a part of a stem. Stem storing food is called rhizome. Underground rhizome gives rise to specialized flowers which are called as cleistogamous. First of all, they are underground. Second one, they are dull. They are not attractive. They don't need to attract the pollinators. So they are very dull in color. Third, they are bisexual. Fourth, they never open. Exactly, Harshil, correct. What you call, yeah, Nandini, correct. Yeah, correct. No anthesis in them. Now, this will ensure that internally they have only one option, and that is to show 100% assured arrangement to show self-fertilization, autogamy, self-pollination, that is autogamy. What's the biggest demerit of these cleistogamy? Helisha, no chance of genetic variations. Absolutely right. Rapid fire reply. Yep. And how about the biggest merit under this setup? Assured seed set in absence of pollination or pollinators, rather, you should write down. Yes, perfect. Assured seed set. Seed set means seed formation ka chance 100% hai, even if there are no pollinators, no requirement of the pollinators in this setup. That was something about the autogamy. Let's go in for the next one. What is that? Second category of pollination. Devanshi, correct. Geitonogamy is the one. Yep. Define geitonogamy. Somebody wrote gritogamy. Now, don't do this thing. Kashish, pollen transfer. I could not read properly. Pollination within the flowers of a same plant. Yes. Enter to the stigma of another flower of a same plant. Yes, it's correct. Technically, आपको पता चल गया है. So I'm not going in too much of detail, but it's between two flowers of a same plant. That is for our understanding. Will they require pollinators or not? So yes, functionally it is what? Self-pollination or a cross-pollination. Functionally it is yes, Kashish and Krisha and others. Correct. Functionally, no, don't write down xenogamy. Just write down cross-pollination. Functionally, it is a cross-pollination. But which way it is a self-pollination? Genetically, yes, Alicia, genetically it is a self-pollination. Remember, genetically self-pollination, functionally a cross-pollination. Which is the third category of pollination? Xenogamy. It's called xenogamy. What is the xenogamy? Yes, it's a transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma in the flowers of two different plants. To make it successful, one has to use the word same species, otherwise in any ways it is a xenogamy. Whether same species plants or different species plants, it's a xenogamy. Just that successful, effective xenogamy will be the one if that's gonna take place between two different plants of a same species. Otherwise, it's xenogamy in any ways. That was the introduction of this topic, pollination. We're gonna go in details of pollination by studying the agents of pollination. So our next topic is agents of pollination. Just hold on. Let's see what's next. Okay, agents of pollination. See, plants use two different agents for achieving pollination. The abiotic factors, such as wind and water, abiotic agents of pollination, rather, I should say. And some of them are biotic agents of pollination. They are the various forms of animals. Wind and water are the two abiotic agents, and various animals are biotic agents. Majority of plants, they use biotic agents for pollination. It's a very small group of plants which prefer abiotic agents for pollination. Particularly when you talk about abiotic agents, uh, very high loss of pollen grain occurs over here. It's not a targeted one. These kind of pollination is not a pinpoint targeted one. So pollen grains are coming in contact with the stigma. It's a chance factor. For example, when they are released in a wind, there is a chance that that floating pollen will drop on the stigma. It's not necessary it will happen all the time. Same is the case when you use the water for pollination. So to compensate for the high uncertainties that are prevailing over here, which are associated with the loss of pollen grains, the flowers are producing enormous amount of pollen as compared to the pollen produced by the plants which are preferring biotic agents for pollination. You see, so comparatively, and even compared to the number of ovules that are there in their setups against the female reproductive structures, the males have to produce large number of pollen grains in these abiotic agents utilizing plants. What they are trying to explain is there are two possibilities regarding pollinating agents, abiotic and biotic. Abiotic include wind and water, Biotic includes various animals. When you use abiotic agents, the pollen grain released from anther, passing through the wind, reaching to the stigma, it's a chance factor. So there are a lot of uncertainties left in this phenomenon, successful pollination. So in that case, the male parts will produce large number of pollen grains compared to the number of ovules produced in these species. Well, as far as biotic agents are concerned, if birds are involved in the pollination, it is called ornithophily. In a way, it's a zoophily when animals are involved. But birds involved, ornithophily, insects involved, entomophily, ants involved, myrmecophily, snails involved, malacophily. If bats are involved, it's called chiropterophily. So these are the different forms of pollinations based on their biotic agents. Our first topic will be pollination by abiotic agents. In that also, the first one is pollination by wind, that is termed as anemophily. It's called anemophily. So let's discuss about anemophily. It is about pollination by wind. Before I go to this one, a quick recap. Question number one, we can classify the pollinating agents into two categories. Which two categories are there? Shruti, correct. Biotic and abiotic are the two categories. In abiotic, which two are included? Yes, Tanvi and others, highly others. Wind and water, yes, correct. Whereas in biotic, it includes what? Animals. Somebody wrote animals and most plants. ये क्या होता है? Animals are responsible and it is written in most plants this is preferred. ऐसा था. तो कुछ लोग लिख रहे हैं biotic agents में animals and plants. क्या डोबे लोग हम. Well, majority of plants use which agents for pollination, biotic or abiotic? Diksha, correct. Biotic agents are more preferred over there. Small proportion of plants, small group of plants prefer the abiotic agents compared to the other one. Why, large number of pollen grains are to be produced in plants which are pollinating through abiotic agents? There is a high loss of pollen. The successful pollination depends on a chance factor. So high loss of a pollen is going to take place, and that's why plant has to produce large number of pollen grains, enormous amount, as compared to the number of ovules available in their flowers in the given species. Let's go through the first one, pollination by wind. It's more common amongst the abiotic pollinations. Like in abiotic pollination, there is a water pollination and wind pollination. Out of the two, the wind pollination is even more desirable, more preferred. As further, the wind pollination requires special features on the part of the plant. For example, the pollen grains are supposed to be light and non-sticky, lightweight, non-sticky. They should be dry and non-sticky. If they are non-sticky, their tendency will remain to continuously float in the air. Sticky हो गए तो कहीं पे stick करके settle हो जाएंगे. So if they are light, if they are dry, if they are non-sticky, they would suspend in wind for a longer time. That will increase the successful chances of pollination. So they can be easily transported in a wind currents. They often possess well-exposed stamens. Well-exposed stamens का meaning क्या होता है? Have a look. Look at this one. Look at this plant and its flowers. Look at the stamens are so many and they are easily exposed to the wind currents. They are well exposed stamens so that wind can easily take away the pollen from them. Another speciality that can be seen is in some plants, for example, in a pinus. If this is the pollen grain, these are its wings. These are its wings, winged pollen. Again, an adaptation that will ensure that the pollen grain easily will be carried in the wind currents. So that's a speciality of pinus pollen, that it is pollinated by wind and it has a wings that will keep it suspended in air for a longer time. Another speciality of these plants and their flowers, they are like this. Look at this one. Feathery stigma. Stigma is feathery. Large often feathery stigma. Stigma large होते हैं और feathery होते हैं. This can easily trap the airborne pollen grains. This kind of a stigma can trap the pollen grain easily from the air. So that's another speciality. Another example, if you see in this case, another feature in this case, wind pollinated plants, that is, wind pollinated flowers, they often have a single ovule in each ovary and numerous flowers are packed into an inflorescence. Sunflower agar aapko yaad ho to, sunflower is not a flower, it's a capitulum type of inflorescence. It's a cluster of so many flowers. So similar to that, here there is a corn. It's not a one flower, it's a cluster of flowers. And each ovary had a single ovule. And as you can see that, the corn cob over here, corn cob, in which the tassels that you see, these are called as tassels. They are nothing but the stigma and style. So large number of tassels in this inflorescence, so many are together, the flowers are together, and their stigma and styles are extended and are projected in air. They are the ones which are waving in the wind to trap the pollen grains. From the corn cob, you can see that this part is waving in the wind in order to trap the floating pollen grains in the air, in the wind. So wind pollinated flowers often have a single ovule in each ovary and numerous flowers are packed into an inflorescence, like in a corn cob, you can see that. Here the tassels that we see on this corn cob, they are the stigma and style, and they are waving in the wind in order to trap the pollen grains over there. The wind pollination with the help of a wind, it's a common phenomenon in ग्रास, मोनोकॉट्स में particularly grasses की जो varieties होती है, most of them get pollinated with the help of wind. They prefer wind pollination or anemophily. Have understood this? Wrong one. Again, wrong one. Where is that slide? Gone away. So if you have any question on this pollination by wind, anemophily, feel free to ask. Okay, it seems you have no question. So I would rapidly go through this one. The features of the, by the way, what is the another term employed for wind pollination? What is another term employed for the wind pollination? Heli, correct. Anemophily. What's the speciality of the pollen grains? Devanshi, you are right. Light and non-sticky. Large number of pollen grains, light, dry, non-sticky, so that they can easily be transported in wind currents, isn't it? What about their stamens? What's the speciality of their stamens? Yes, Trusty, correct. They are well exposed, so they can easily discharge their pollen grains in the wind current. What's the speciality of the stigma in these kind of plants? Pari, correct. Feathery, large and feathery stigma, so that they can easily trap the airborne pollen grains. What's the speciality of these plants' ovaries with regard to the number of ovules they have? They tend to be, yes, Karuna and Trusty, correct. They tend to be single ovule carrying ovaries over there. What about the flowers? Numerous flowers pack into what? Inflorescence, Kashish, correct. The tassels that we see in the corn cob, they are actually which parts of their flowers? Kea, correct. Stigma and styles of these. Not only stigma, write down stigma and style, mainly the style they are, elongated tubular structures, so that they can be wave in the wind and get the pollen grains trapped from the wind currents. Which category plants most commonly exhibit wind pollination? Wind pollination is yes. In all gymnosperms, wind pollination is the only option. In most grasses, wind pollination is the only option. Well, a break for 5 minutes and we will resume the work and we'll start with wind after this one. Yeah, water pollination is our next topic. So break for 5 minutes. Have you already? Madam, hold on with the recording. Pollination by water, that is called hydrophily. Let's talk about hydrophily. It's a very rare phenomenon in flowering plants, hardly seen in 30 different genera amongst the monocots. Amongst the monocot plants, 30 different genera of the monocot plants are the ones which show this hydrophily. Compared with this one, if you see the lower plants, amongst the flowering plants, very few prefer the hydrophily. Comparing this with the lower plants such as bryophytes, pteridophytes, if you see, even algae, so majority of them or virtually all of them require water for their successful fertilization. We can't say pollination because they don't have flowers, but for their sexual reproduction. All algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes, the lower forms, use water for their successful sexual reproduction. And against this, if you see higher plants, very few prefer water as a medium for their sexual reproduction to transfer their gametes. Very few prefer that aspect. In fact, algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes, their distributions are limited because they all require water for their successful sexual reproduction. So that dependence on the water is lost in angiosperms, the flowering plants. So very few of them prefer water as a medium to transfer their pollen grains. Coming to the aquatic plants, not even all aquatic plants prefer the hydrophily. For example, yes, Vallisneria, hydrilla are the freshwater plants which prefer hydrophily. Marine grasses, sea grasses such as Zostera, again, they are the ones which prefer the hydrophily. But large number of plants, let's say water lily and water hyacinth. Water lily and water hyacinth. This is the water lily. This is the water hyacinth. I'm sure you know water hyacinth. Which one? Water hyacinth means Eichhornia crescens. Okay. So in majority of the aquatic plants, such as water hyacinth and water lily, the flowers emerge above the water level. Look at their flowers. What's the specialty of these flowers? Have a look at it. These flowers are not in the water, they are above the water surface. So no ways water can help them in pollination. Actually, they're dependent upon the insects even or wind, in order to carry out their pollination. So just like the land plants, they also prefer insects and winds to carry out their pollination. So that is something which you had to understand. बोलिए, conceptually clarity मिला आपको? See, plants, most of the angiospermic plants, if you see, most of the angiospermic plants, if you see in them, water is not a medium for pollination. Very limited number of plants prefer water as a medium for pollination. How many genera of the aquatic plants, particularly monocot plants, are involved in this 30 genera in which it is restricted? Amongst the lower plants, lower plant groups, which plant groups exclusively depend upon water for their sexual reproduction, the transmit of gametes? Lower plants. I'm not talking about flowering plants. Non-flowering lower plants, amongst them, yes, Diksha, correct. Bryophytes, algae, pteridophytes, etc. exclusively depend upon water for their transmit of gametes and sexual reproduction. And this actually leads to which condition? Restricted distribution of these plants. Achha, amongst the higher plants, which are the freshwater plants which prefer hydrophily? Hydrilla, as you can see in the picture, and Vallisneria. Hydrilla and Vallisneria. These are the ones which will prefer pollination. This is the Vallisneria rather. So they will prefer the pollination through water. Then another example. Amongst the marine plants, which plants? Yes, this is the Zostera, marine grass, seagrass. They prefer pollination through water only. And amongst the majority of the aquatic plants, which are the plants which do not use water for pollination over there? Water hyacinth and water lily. This is the first one is water lily with the circular leaves, flattened circular leaves. And second is water hyacinth. Their preference is what for pollination? Insects or wind. Kashish, correct. They prefer insects or winds for pollination. Now let's talk about pollination in detail in case of Vallisneria. See, understand the technicalities over here in pollination in Vallisneria. That point is that the female flowers, they have a very long stalk. Let's say that this is the female flower. And here is its long stalk. Flower stalk is very long. It remains like a coiled spring. Okay. Male flowers detach from mother plant. These are the male flowers. They detach from the mother plant and keep suspending on the surface of water. These male flowers detach from the mother plant and keep on the surface of the water. And there they release their pollen grains on the surface of the water. यहाँ पे ही अपने pollen grains release कर देते हैं ये male flowers water surface पे. They are passively, floating on the surface of water over there. At the stigma receptivity point, in a female flower, the stalk gets uncoiled. It becomes straight. It brings the flowers at the surface of the water. And some of these pollen grains which are floating on the water surface, they are carried up to its stigma. The moment the female flower is pollinated with these pollen grains which were on the water surface, again the stalk will recoil, bring the female flower from the surface again back underwater status in which it is brought back. But you see here there was no pollen, here there is a pollen received on it. This is how the pollen, Vallisneria carries out pollination over here. Do you get the sense of what I taught? Pollination in Vallisneria. Vallisneria is an aquatic plant. Entire plant body is underwater. Male flowers get detached from the mother plant, come to the water surface and release the pollen grains on the water surface. which keep on floating with this water. When a female flowers, which are already having a very long coiled stalk, when they are in the time of receptivity of stigma, the stalk becomes uncoiled, it becomes straight, brings the female flower to the water surface. At the water surface, some of the floating, pollen grains reach to the stigma of the female flower. Once pollinated, as you can see that the stalk will be recoiled, bringing the flower back from the surface to the underwater status. That's how the pollination occurs in Vallisneria. Explain the pollination in Vallisneria. What's the speciality of the male flowers? What's the speciality of male flowers in case of Vallisneria? Detach from the mother plant, underground, underwater rather, and come to the water surface. That's the way one has to shoot the handwritten detailed information. They detach from the mother plant and come to the water surface and release their pollen on the water surface. What's the speciality of a female flower in Vallisneria? Having a very long stalk. Long and coiled stalk, as you can see here. Having a very long and coiled stalk. What happens to the stalk at the time of stigma receptivity? It uncoils, isn't it? Becomes straight and brings the female flower at the water surface. Now here what's going to happen once the female flowers are also on the water surface and already pollen was released on the water surface by male flowers. Receiving the pollen, isn't it? And again it's going to coil the floral stalk and bring the flower underwater. That's the kind of pollination that occurs in a Vallisneria using water as a medium over there. In another group of water pollinated plants such as a seagrass, this plant is a seagrass. Now its specialty is that throughout the pollination, male and female flowers will remain underwater, submerged in the water. Female flowers will also remain underwater and male flowers will also remain underwater throughout. So what happens is that pollen grains are released inside the water. They are released inside the water. Let's say this is the male flower, this is the female flower, and this is the water surface. So now both are underwater. Male has liberated these pollen grains. These pollen grains, they are released in the water. They will float in the water and will reach to the female plant over there. They will reach to the female plant over there and will settle on the stigma. Mostly these pollen grains are ribbon shaped. If you see carefully, pollen is like a ribbon. So it can easily carried in the passively, it can be carried inside the water and many of them can reach to the stigma and achieve pollination. So that's a specialty of these plants. One more feature in general for all, aquatic plants which are pollinated with the water, their pollen grains have a mucilaginous covering around them. The mucilaginous material around the pollen grain. Example, I show, tell you about this thing. Some seeds, when you drop in water, a jelly-like layer is created around them. Have you seen them? Tucmaria seeds. When you drop them in water, they have a jelly-like stuff. That jelly-like stuff is a mucilaginous stuff. See, the mucilaginous covering around their pollen in the aquatic plants prevent their pollen from sinking. अगर जेली लाइक म्यूसिलेजिनस लेयर है तो वो सिंक नहीं हो, सिंक होते तो क्या हो गए, वो डाउन जाएंगे. बट म्यूसिलेजिनस लेयर है, instead of down, they will go horizontally to reach to the female flowers. So always remember, the mucilaginous layer around the pollen in hydrophily showing plants prevents their pollen from becoming wet, prevent them from wetting and sinking. That is something you need to understand. What's the name of seagrass, a marine variety? Yes, it is termed as Zostera. It is termed as Zostera. What's the speciality of the male and female flowers of this plant? Yug, correct. They will always remain underwater, always in a submerged state. Male will release the pollen grains, which will reach to the female flower underwater and will carry out pollination. What's the specialty regarding the shape of these pollen grains? Exactly, Asta and Tanvi, ribbon-shaped pollen, so that they can easily be carried passively inside the water and reach to the stigma. In general, for most of the water pollinated species, what's a special protection given to the pollen grain? Mucilaginous layer, isn't it? Heli and Asta, correct. It will protect the pollen grain against what? It's gonna, yes. उससे पहले, sinking से पहले भी, before sinking, one more point. Getting wet, Shruti, correct. Preventing the pollen from getting wet or wetting, and then preventing its sinking. See, in abiotic pollination, one thing is common, that whether the flowers are pollinated by the wind or by water, generally they are non-attractive. They are not attractive enough over there because they don't need to attract any pollinator. Now we are reaching to the next point, and that is pollination with the help of biotic agents. Anemophily. Well, in general, it is called zoophily, not anemophilia. Pollination by animals, and that is called as a zoophily. Here is the list of the various animals and organisms that are involved in the pollination by animals, that is in a zoophily. This list includes, first of all, insects, bees, butterflies, beetles, flies, wasps, ants, moths. So many different varieties of insects get involved in the pollination. As far as birds are concerned, sunbird and hummingbird are the two common birds which may be involved. Then Other higher animals or other animals, if you consider bats, Chiropterophalia, I told you, many primates like lemur and other monkeys may be involved indirectly in that process of pollination. Then arboreal rodents. Arboreal means tree dwellers. Those which live on the tree are called as tree dwellers. They are called as arboreal. Example, squirrel and others. So such rodents is a one group under mammals. Mouse, rats, squirrels, they come under the same category. So amongst the larger animals, the primates are involved like lemurs, then arboreal tree dweller rodents are involved in the process. Some of the lizards are involved, gecko lizards, then garden lizard, chameleon and others, tree lizards. So they have been reported to carry out pollination in many plants over there. See, one speciality for the zoophily is that the flowers that prefer the zoophily, they are pollinated by the animals. They are specifically adapted for the pollination carried out by a particular species of animal. Means there is some sort of a bonding that develops between pollinator and the pollinating plant as far as zoophily is concerned. That a given plant is pollinated by a particular animal. So it will show certain adaptations to attract that animal again and again for pollination. So these kind of a specific bonding develops during evolution between the plant and its pollinating animal agent. Let's talk about one of them specifically, that is pollination by insects, that is entomophily. Pollination by insects, entomophily. See, there is a tendency for these insect pollinated plants to have a large, colorful, fragrant, and rich in nectar. These type of plants they are, these type of flowers they produce. First of all, flowers are large enough so insect can see it from distance, insect can visit it. They are colorful, so insects can be attracted towards them. There must be some sort of a fragrance that can attract the insects, and sort of a reward in the form of nectar supply. So the flowers have a small glands called nectaries, small glands named as nectaries, which secrete nectar, a nutritious juice that is attracting the insects. They come and collect it and they carry out pollination over there. When the flowers are small in this category, the number of flowers are clustered into an inflorescence to make them conspicuous. Conspicuous का meaning होता है easily visible, very prominently seen. Classic example is sunflower. I already mentioned about sunflower that it is not a flower, it is the inflorescence. In a sunflower, there are so many flowers, ray florets and disc florets. Disc florets participate in a reproduction. So many disc florets over there together along with ray florets, they make an inflorescence called capitulum inflorescence in sunflower. This attracts, the inflorescence itself is an attraction for the insects. Insects come and visit this kind of attractive inflorescence. So that's a specialty. Animals are also attracted to flowers by color and fragrance. Flowers pollinated by flies and beetles secrete foul odors. You know, this one. Flies and beetles carry out pollination in plants which secrete foul odors. This foul odor, that dirty smell, attracts many flies and beetles towards those plants over there. To sustain the animal visits, to sustain the animal visits means to make sure that animals frequently visit these flowers. There has to be certain rewards. We call them as the floral rewards in the form of nectar or in the form of pollen. Nectar and pollen grain are these usual floral rewards. For harvesting these rewards, the animals or the insects will visit from one flower to another flower, and in that process they come in contact with these anthers, and many a times this pollen grain stick to them and they transfer them to the stigma of another one. So that's how they carry out the pollination. See, in some species, what happens is that there are, by the way, some pollen robbers or nectar robber categories of insects which will visit the plant, its flowers, consume the pollen or nectar, and do not help in pollination. For example, bumblebees. Bumblebees are nectar robbers. They visit the flower, collect the nectar, but do not help at all in the pollination. So when you offer the floral rewards, there might be a misuse of these floral rewards with the help of these nectar robbers. It is possible. In some species, what happens is that the floral reward may be something else other than the pollen and nectar. The plant may be providing safe places for oviposition, that is egg laying. Have a look at it. In some species, the floral rewards are in the form of providing the safe places to lay the eggs. The classic example is the tallest flower called Amorphophallus, and having the 6 feet height. I show you the plant, Amorphophallus. First of all, Amorphophallus in this plant, this is the inflorescence, not the flower, first of all. When they say now that it is the largest flower, it's a wrong information. They have a largest inflorescence, maybe ranging up to 6 feet. On these, there are small little flowers on the surface of these. There are small little flowers. They get pollinated by the beetle, carrion beetle. Now, this is the carrion beetle. अच्छा, इसके कंपेयर में इसका साइज इतना स्मॉल होगा, छोटा सा बीटल होगा. यहाँ पे हमने एनलार्ज पिक्चर लिया है. इसका मीनिंग ऐसा नहीं कि ये बीटल भी इसके साइज का है. बीटल एकदम छोटे साइज का होता है, एक छोटे से स्मॉल डॉट in front of this big plant. So a very small beetle called carrion beetle, it lays its eggs safely in the inflorescence between the flowers on the surface of this huge inflorescence. But in the process of laying the eggs, visiting the different parts of its inflorescence, visiting different flowers, male and female flowers, it will carry out pollination in the same. Another such example that you can see. Here is the yucca plant. You may have seen this one even. This is the yucca plant. And here are the flowers. Yucca plant flowers. Now there is a one particular variety of moth that is called as pronuba moth. I'll show you its pic. This is that pronuba moth. It cannot complete its life cycle without the yucca plant. It essentially requires yucca plant to lay the eggs safely, to let the larvae hatch out from these eggs within the flowers of the yucca plant. And further, those larvae will eat certain part of this, flower components and successfully survive over there. Have a look at it, this one. This is yucca flower. This is pronuba moth. The moth will deposit its eggs in the chambers of the ovary, that said locules of the ovary, and inside this flower. The flower in turn will get pollinated by the moth. Moth को क्या benefit है? उसके eggs का safe location होता है. इसके chamber, ovary chambers में वो eggs रखता है, so they are safe over there. Not only that, but the larvae that are going to come out from these eggs, okay, they will feed upon certain parts of the ovary over there and even seeds. So that is the advantage to the pronuba moth. Without this plant, it cannot continue its life cycle. But on the other part, yucca plant and its flowers, what is the benefit for them? While the female is trying to lay the eggs over there, in a process, the moth is carrying out pollination in the same. So both are benefited from each other. This is about the insect pollination. बोलिए, follow हुआ आपको? Did you follow this entire process? Carrion beetle in case of Amorphophallus plant, pronuba moth in case of yucca plant flowers, flies and beetles in case of plants, their flowers secreting foul smell, foul odor. All that stuff I have now explained. Now, if you have any question, you ask. Otherwise, we will revise it and wind up the matter for the day. Have any doubts in the same? No. Then the first question. What are the specialities of the flowers when they are pollinated by the insects? And what is the name of insect pollination? What is the name of insect pollination? Another name for insect pollination is what? Entomophily. Dikshan Heli, correct. Further, what's the speciality of these flowers? In general, these flowers, size-wise, they are large. Other features, normally colorful, attractive, fragrance giving ones, and also providing what? They are also providing rewards such as pollen and nectar, isn't it? In case if flowers are small in these cases, So then what they do? If plant wants to be pollinated by insect, and if flowers are small in size, they make a conspicuous inflorescence, isn't it? To attract the insects. To sustain the, to sustain the visits of insects, they need to provide the various rewards. But sometimes there are ones which will visit the flower and yet getting the reward and yet not helping in pollination. What you call them as? Yeah, those insects are called as robbers, nectar robbers or pollen robbers. Some of the insects get attracted by flowers with the foul smell, foul odor. Which ones get attracted by the foul smell and odor? Flies and bees. Foul odor that is going to attract them. Flies and beetles, basically. Flies and bees nahi, flies and beetles. Make a correction. It's about flies and beetles. How about uh, carrion beetle? It shows pollination in which one? Amorphophallus. Pushti, correct. What's a speciality? How much big is its flower? 6 feet, tallest flower. Ideally क्या होना चाहिए था? It should have been tallest. Exactly. Tallest inflorescence, not the flower. Single flower इतना बड़ा नहीं है. वो inflorescence इतना बड़ा है, उसकी surface पे छोटे छोटे flowers लगे हुए होते हैं. It will provide the safe place for egg laying and larvae to hatch out. So that's how they help in pollination, the carrion beetles. Second, Pronuba moth is a pollinator for which plant? Yucca. Now, what kind of intimate bonding is there between them, Yucca and Pronuba moth? What kind of a dependence they have now developed in evolution? That what both of them cannot complete their life cycle without Yucca, and vice versa. Cannot come. Diksha was the first one to reply, and then Devanshi. They cannot complete their life cycles in absence of each other. That's a kind of dependence the Yucca and Pronuba moth have shown. What's the benefit to the Pronuba moth in this dependence? Safe places for egg laying. It gets a safe places for deposition of eggs, and larvae shall hatch out by the time seeds are developing over there, and hatching larvae will feed upon the parts of ovary and other things. These are the benefits to the Pronuba moth. And what is the benefit to the Yucca plant? While female comes for laying the eggs, she helps in pollination. Well, if you have a flowers at home, if you have a plants at home, and if you have a flowers in them, and if you will see that any insect is sitting upon it, try to observe this thing. It's interesting. It's a beautiful thing of a nature. You can study these kind of phenomena in a nature easily over there. Well, today I conclude the lecture with this note. Next lecture, we will continue the topics, outbreeding devices and other topics related with pollination only. Goodbye.